This week number 13 is divided up into two different parts. And in the first part, which is the majority of this week, we are discussing quite a number of pseudo selectors, by which we can minimize, reduce our original selection that we are doing by using our element or attribute selectors. For example, I have created 12 orange boxes here, and those 12 orange boxes, they are children of another container box. And if we are selecting all these children right in here, we can then from that point onwards, we can reduce that selection to, for example, only the very first one, only the very last one, every second one, every third one, the last four, the first five. All these kind of things we can do without having to hand out any classes or identities to our children right here, which keeps our HTML code more clean. And we do also not need to come up with any class values with the names that we want to give to our classes or with ID values. And therefore it makes it also more logical inside our CSS code what we are actually selecting here. That will be the very first part in this week. And then in the second part, we are taking a look at the remaining properties that we have under the category of styling. In more particular, it is the category of outside the box styling, which includes, for example, also the border, which is outside the box. It also belongs kind of to that styling outside. However, the border at the same time is also in charge, or is also involved in the dimensions of a certain element or of an element. And therefore, we have already discussed this one in week number 3. Border image, there is also an image involved, so this one we have discussed as well when we have talked about images in week number 8. However, what we haven't yet taken a look at is, for example, the outline. The outline property is very similar to the border. There are a couple of differences, and also what we haven't discussed is box shadow, giving our boxes that are not text boxes a shadow, since we do also have text shadow, for example, which we already have taken a look at, and this one is quite similar. It's just only applied to non-text elements, and we do have a couple of more options that we can use here. Also what we can use, also what we haven't discussed yet, is the border radius, by which we can make rounded edges, rounded corners on a box, which we will also be taking a look at. Now with border radius, with border as well as with box shadow, we ultimately can create shapes. And this will be part of the beginning of next week. So we are making the path basically towards next week by taking a look at those. And next week also will, for example, be animations. Let's now get started into this week and let's take a look at those pseudo selectors by which we can reduce, minimize our original selection that we have done by using our element or attribute selectors. And let's first of all get familiar with first of type, last of type, first child and last child by taking a look at those orange boxes here. And therefore we are now doing quite some random examples now in order to get used to them. And then afterwards we are going into real examples where those pseudo selectors would be useful on our website. So those 12 boxes here, these orange boxes, I have created not only by using just one single element type. I have used two different types in order to create them, div as well as p elements. The div type element is a container box by which has no meaning. It is a neutral container box. The p is a container box as well. However, this one has meaning. It is used when we are creating paragraphs. So therefore we are dealing with two different types here, the p and the div element type. And all these boxes, those 12 ones, are inside another meaningful container box, which is of type element type section. And this one I have given an identity value of selectors container. Let us now, for example, select the very first one in here without having to give this very first element a class or an identity. So the parent has an identity which we can select in CSS, and this one we will be selecting. And from that point onwards, first of all, we need to select what we want in here, what elements, for example. So for example, let's go for, we want all the div elements that are children of the element with the identity selectors container. And that's part of our selection. That all belongs to our element selectors. Here we are selecting by type, by ID, by class, the children, the descendants, for example. And there are two other ones which we are taking a look at in this week. So this is all part of the element selection. And now we are attaching one of those pseudo selectors. And the first one we are now using is first-of-type. And what this one will do now, we have selected all our div elements and we are now reducing our selection to only the very first one, which is this div element of the type div right here. Let's go for the other one, and that is last-of-type. And of course it will now select the last div element. It will reduce our original selection that we have done by using our element selectors. It will reduce it down to only the very last one. So where does this naming convention, however, come from? Last-of-type, first-of-type. And this is what we will now inspect. If I would now change this value here away to our all selector, the asterisk selector, what this one does, it now selects all the children that are inside the element that we have given the identity selectors container, meaning in our current selection now are all the children, and those children are comprised not only of div but also of p elements. And this is what this last-of-type is referring to. It will now select the last of each element type that is inside the original element selection. So we have two different types in here, and therefore it will now select not only the last div element but also the last p element, meaning in our selection right now are two elements, not only one. And this only happens when we have more than one element in our selection, only happens when the element selection part already comprises more than one element type, which is the case right now since we are selecting div as well as p elements, and from those we want the last-of-type, last of each type, the last div and the last p. So if I would once again change this back to a div, then we have already reduced this selection here to only div elements, so to only one single element type, and therefore of course only that last one of that type will be selected. So this only happens that we have more than one element inside our selection if our element selection already comprises more than one element type, which is only the case in this situation when we are going for the asterisk, which is all. Once we have all selected, this is now in this situation comprised of p as well as div elements. Meaning depending on the situation, it either has one or more elements inside the selection when we are making use of the last-of-type or the first-of-type properties, the pseudo selectors. Let us now take a look at the other ones, and that is first and last child. First child. Let me once again change it back to div, or actually, what does first child refer to? Most likely it refers to the first element inside its parent. And this is also the case. However, the logical thinking here is a little bit different than we most likely would assume at the beginning. So if we only select the parent element, and from that point onwards we are attaching now that pseudo selector first child, that is the most logical, I would argue, the most logical way of thinking. We are selecting the parent, and from that point onwards we are selecting the first child, meaning most likely it will be this one. And there is also the last child. And most likely we are selecting the parent, from that point onwards the last child, which most likely would be this one. However, this is not the logical approach that is going on here. So what we first need to do is, from the parent element, we are selecting what we want inside there, which element we want to select first of all. So let me once again start with the divs. So we have now selected the divs element inside here. However, the complete way is now different, since we are still selecting the last child here, meaning the last child inside its parent, this one. Now, this one is here referring to a condition. If this last child inside its parent is in fact of the type div, then and only then it will be selected. Now this last child inside its parent is a P element, and therefore this selection will not have resulted in anything. We have now 0 elements being selected, since the condition is not met, since the last child is not a div element. If I would now change this away to a P element, so we are still selecting now, this is referring to the last child. So it's kind of the P elements that we have selected first of all the children here, all the children that are P elements, is kind of not working in the way that is usually the case once we are making use of last and first child. Since it's always going on that the last or the first child is being selected, and this part of the selection is to then just providing the condition. Is that the case? Is this last element inside its parent? Is this one a P element? Which is in this current situation the case, and therefore now we have one element being selected, which is this last child, since it has met this condition that it is a P element, and therefore this one has been selected now. Once again, let's go over one more example. Let me change it to first child. So what the browser will do in this situation, it will select the first child only under the condition when this one is a P element, which is not, it's a div element, meaning we do not have anything being selected right now by using this selection. If I change it to a div element, the browser does what the browser does. It takes a look at the first child, and then it takes a look at the condition. Is this one a div element? Yes, it is. So this one is now being selected, meaning we have one element being selected by using this selector here, this complete selector. And this tells us that the first child and the last child either have one element being selected or 0, depending whether the condition is met. When we are using first of type or last of type, then there is at least one element being selected. And sometimes it happens that there are multiple elements being selected in a situation that the element selector already selects elements of different types. Then ultimately this will result in multiple elements being selected. Otherwise it will always be only one single element being selected. So this is definitely something to get used to. And we have quite a number of examples now in order to do so. And the first example is in regards to our lists. Our list that we have used in order to create our navigation. In order to give it meaning, since navigation lists always shall be created by using those li elements, and these li elements, list items, these are the only elements that can be children of the unordered list. Now those li elements I haven't given any class, and therefore how do we select it? We can do so by targeting its grandparent, since this one has an identity. And from that point onwards we can then go for the descendant selector. So from that point onwards, since the child is an unordered list, a UL element, the LI elements are grandchildren, so descendants in this situation, and the descendant selector is just a white space. And from this point onwards, we are now doing the selection of what we want to do. For example, we want the first one or the last one. And whether we are now using first child or first of type or last of type or last child, we will have a look at now in a moment. First of all, what do we want to accomplish? There is a reasoning now why we are taking a look at those list items. I have already selected those list items here, and I have given all those list items a border at the bottom of 1 pixel in white. So here we have our list items, and each of them has a border at the bottom of 1 pixel in white. And all of those list items seem to be closed up inside borders, always on top and bottom. However, there is not really a border at the top given to them, which I have given them for the list items. This top border is just the bottom border of the previous list item, which ultimately makes them to look closed up inside two borders always. But only the other list items and not the first one, since the very first list item has not another list item that precedes it, and therefore this preceding list item, which would give it a border at the bottom and therefore would make it appear closed up inside borders, this one doesn't exist. So in this situation, what we want to do, we want to select only the very first list item in order to also give it a border at the top, so that each and every list item here are closed up in between borders. And which element selector are we using now depends. So let's take a look at both of them. First child we can use, or first of type. First child, will that one ultimately result in the first element being selected? It always depends on the condition. Whether the li is in fact the first child inside its parent element. And this first one is in fact a li element, therefore the condition is met, and therefore we have now selected the very first list item, and this is now therefore the option that we could go for. And this is the case since list items are the only elements that can be inside this parent. So it will always be the case in this scenario. If we are now going for first of type, let's take a look whether this one would work as well. Because there are sometimes situations where both of those ways we can accomplish the exact same thing. So first of type, what will this one do? It will select the first one of each type. And since the li elements, once again, are the only children that can be inside the unordered list, this is the reason why there is only one type. Secondly, we have already reduced the type to only one single type by using our element selection right here. We only wanted the li descendants, nothing else. There is only one type. And therefore, since there is only one type, there will definitely not be more than one element being selected. It will only be the very first one, meaning this option would also succeed ultimately. It would also give us the result that we wanted of only selecting the very first list item. So in this situation, it doesn't really matter which one we are using, completely up to us. And now what we want to achieve, we want to give it a border at the top of 1 pixel solid in white. Let me now reload the page, and now all our list items seem to be or are closed up in between borders. Of course, we could have also gone the other way around. Now let me once again outcomment this selection, and instead of now giving each and every list item a border at the bottom, let me now give it a border at the top. Meaning, there is a border at the top of every list item. All the list items would seem to be closed up in between two borders. However, now in this situation, the last one is not closed up, since there is no list item that comes afterwards, which would give it its border top to this previous one to make it closed up in between borders. Meaning in this situation, we would have to select the very last one. Now, since the situation doesn't change, list items are the only children that can be inside its parent unordered list. So first last child would work absolutely well, since the condition is met. The last child is an li element. If we are going for last of type, we have already reduced first of all the element selection to only one single type. Therefore, there will not be more than one element being selected. So we could go for last of type or last child in both situations as well. It's just the other way around, basically, what we are doing here from the previous example. Of course, what we need to change now, we want a border at the bottom for this very last list item. And now we have exactly the same result. Let's go into a second example in regards to a table. And we are basically duplicating now our example. Here is our head of the table. Last week we have introduced the meaningful container boxes for the head and for the body of the table. The T-head element, table head element, and the table body element, the T-body element. The T-body wraps all this data that belongs to the body, the major part of the table. The T-head element wraps the head, the column headlines. That's the header part of the table. And this one consists of two rows, TR elements. The first row consists of the top column headlines, and then the second row consists of the subcategory headlines. Let's take a look at those ones in form of code in HTML. Right here there is the T-head element, and that one includes two rows. We are always creating our table row by row, not column by column. And what we want to do now is we want to divide the first top category row up from the subcategory row. By also, once again, let's give it a border in white. Let's give the very first row inside the table head, only the very first row, a border at the bottom. And therefore what we can target, what we can select here is the t-head or whichever element we have given an identity or a class further up. Since this table head, since this is the only table that I'm using on my website, so I could just as well go for the t-head now, since it is the only element, the only t-head element inside the HTML code, meaning only this one will be selected. And from that point onwards, let me select the tr elements that are children after the t-head element. Meaning in the current selection, in this element selection, they are still part, this is the element selection. This part here is now selecting both table rows. And once again, we are encountering exactly the same situation right here. Since the t-head as well as the t-body or the t-foot, the only children elements that can be in there are the tr elements. Meaning if we are now going for first child, it would definitely be the first row that will be selected. Since the condition is met, it will be a tr element. That's the only elements that can be inside its parent, the children inside here. So once again, first of child would absolutely work, and first of type would also work for the reason that first of all, once again, there are only tr elements, only of one single element type. There cannot be another type in here. And secondly, we have already reduced it down to inside our element selection to only one single type, meaning there will not be more than one element being selected. It will only be one, and it will be the first of its type. And the only type that there is the tr element. So with first of type, we would also ultimately succeed. We would have our first row inside our selection. Now let me give this one a border at the bottom. So this is basically a duplication of the exact example what we have just used in regards to our list items. And the reason why I wanted to go over this one is to bring something across that I didn't mention last week. So if I would now give this one a border at the bottom of 1 pixel solid in white, this one will not yet work. And the reason is that we have discussed last week, nothing has worked. That all the table elements are behaving in their own way. tr, th, td, t-head, table itself. They all have their own behavior. And this is because of the display property. There are values for the display property that have been applied to these elements by the browser in his own default style sheet. And therefore, these elements are behaving like they are. For example, table rows, for example, we cannot give them any width, since the width is defined by the table itself, by the columns, by the total amount, by the total width of the columns. So this is one behavior. Another behavior is, and this is what I now want to bring across, is that table rows cannot have a border unless the border has been collapsed. And this is a property that we are applying on the table itself. Border collapse, by default the value that's being used here is separate, and we can change it to collapse, meaning now the borders of each and every cell inside our table, of each and every cell, meaning all th and td elements, is now merged, collapsed into each other, and this would now work. It will now be applied the bottom border of the very first row that we have defined, that we have selected right here and applied this setting on. Alternatively, we could, of course, also target each individual cell that is inside here. Inside the very first row, there are 3 cells, th elements. These are the cell boxes, just boxes ultimately. And these are the cells inside the very first row. And those cells I have already, all the cells inside the table, I have brought together by the property that I have applied border spacing. Let me outcomment border collapse, and let me once again, let's do a little bit quick repetition what border spacing actually does. It defines the space in between the individual cells, and I have already brought them down to 0, meaning they are now all next to each other. And this tells us if we would give each and every cell here a border at the bottom, we would ultimately receive the exact same visual outcome. We would also have a line that divides now the top row up from the bottom row. And the reason why we are going over this is to indicate to us that the pseudo selector that we are always attaching here to the element selection does not necessarily need to be the last part. So in this situation, what we want to select in this situation is we want the first row, which we have achieved already, and from that point onwards we want all the th elements. So all the children that are th, so we can go on in selection right after a pseudo selector as well, and this is what I will now be applying to the table cells, this border at the bottom, and not to the table row anymore, which nevertheless ultimately gives us the exact same result. It is just a different way of doing things. And let us now also give each and every cell inside the very first row also a border on the right side, so the columns are also a little bit more visually divided up. And therefore, how do we go about this? And we of course can also make use of multiple pseudo selectors inside a selection. So our current selection, we are now down to the th elements that are children of the first row that is inside the table head element. And from that point onwards, what we want to select is the very last element right here. Since this one shall not have a border on the right, because that would not look good. Let me just apply the border first of all, which I now forgot. Let me apply the border on the right side. So now the columns are also nicely divided up. However, the last cell has of course also received this border on the right side, and this border on the last cell on the right side somehow seems to be out of place, doesn't look good. So if we want to select this one, we are just going further down here. From all th elements we want only the last one. And once again, it does not matter whether we are using last child or last of type. Since we do only have th elements in here, the last element will be the a of type. The condition is met, it will be a th element. And in terms of last of type, same thing, there are only elements of one type, and further we have already reduced it right here to only one type, so meaning there won't be any more than one element being selected, only the very last one. So it doesn't matter once again which one we are going for. Let me now first of type, or no, we are going for last of type or last child, doesn't matter in this situation. And let me now remove the border from the very last cell inside the first row of the table head. So border on the right side I am now setting to none. We do not want any border right there, which looks much better than it did before. Let's go inside the table, and in regards to our columns, last week we have introduced the call group and the call element by which we can indirectly address the columns. Since we are always creating our table row by row using the tr element, there is no tc element or no element that is wrapping the entire column inside it. So we cannot select an element in order to target the column. However, we can do so indirectly. So what we can do, we can just target, for example, each second cell inside a row or each first td element. Since the first cell in each row is a th element, I have used this one instead, since this is the row headline. It is the headline for each and every row, always the first cell right here. And the second element is a td element. So are all the other ones. These are table data cells, not table header cells, but table data. And if we now wanted to select, for example, this very first td element only, we can do so by using one of the first child or first of type selector. And this is now the first situation where we do encounter where we can only use one of them. So let me first of all select all the table rows. And from the table rows onwards, we want all the td elements. So therefore we can of course also use the descendant selector. Let me go down immediately to the tds, and from that point onwards, we only want, for example, the first child. So what is going on here? What the browser will do, it takes a look at the first child in regards to its parent. And if, that's the condition, if this one is a td element, it will select it. Otherwise, it will not. So therefore, it will not work in this situation. Since the first element is not meeting the condition of being a td element, it is in fact of type th. So the first child is out of question now. This one we cannot use in order to get our result that we wanted. in order to select the first TD element. Let's take a look at the first of type. What will this one do? Now we can be certain that there will only be one element being selected. Since we have already reduced it down to only one single type, we have already set it inside the element selection that we only want the TD elements. So only of that type, meaning it will only select now the first of each type. And here we must pay attention to also that this will now not select all TD elements and then only use the first type, so meaning only the very first one. Instead, this is also in regards to its parent, once we are now using a pseudo selector together with a descendant selector. So this is always applying now to the very first TD element in regards to its parent. So also something to get used to, but this is only the case when we are using a pseudo selector as well, in addition to using the descendant selector. So something to pay attention to here as well. First of type, and this one will work. It will now select the very first one, the first of each type in each of each element in regards to its parent, meaning this one is selected, this one, and so on, this one, ultimately giving us indirectly the control basically of a column. Even though we do not have an element that represents a column, we still can get indirectly control by just selecting in this situation the first TD element, which gives us now the control over the second column of this table. And let me now apply this one right here, first of type, and now let me give those ones just a different color. This is one of the properties that we cannot use when we are dealing with col group or col, which we have introduced last week, since they limit us to 4 properties only, which is background, border, visibility, and one more, which doesn't come to my mind right now. But color is not one of them. So this is now the situation, how we can achieve it to, for example, change the color of a column, indirectly of a column, basically saying every second cell in each row, which indirectly gives us now the control over this second column. If we are now taking a look at the last one, at the last column, we also do have control. And in this situation, it doesn't really matter anymore whether we are going for last of type or last child, since in this situation, the last child is a TD element. The condition is met, the last child in regards to its parent. Therefore, we could go for last of type or last child. In this situation, it doesn't really matter anymore. So it's completely up to us which pseudo selector we would want to use if we wanted to select the very last column. Let's go on into another example, and that one is down here in regards to an article. I have created an article here that comprises, first of all, a headline. So I have used a H2 element here since it is already a sub-headline of an entire section. And this is our top headline. This is the H1. And we should always go down in that order. So if there is a subheadline to this one, then this is H2. The next subheadline of this one, if there would be another subheadline somewhere in here, would be H3, etc. So this is a H2 element which I have used here. And then this element is followed by 3 P elements, paragraphs, paragraph container boxes. H2 elements, they are also just container boxes, nothing else, meaningful container boxes, of course. And then underneath I have 2 images, and therefore this party of this article is made up of 3 different types of elements. Let's take a look at those in terms of HTML right down here. So here is the H2 element followed by 3 P elements followed by 2 image elements. And all of these elements I have wrapped inside its own container box, since this section belongs together. And the container box I have used here is the meaningful container box article of the type article, element type article, which I have given an identity of first article. If we now wanted to select the first image, how would we go about this one? So let's take a look. Let's target the parent once again, and from that point onwards what we want the children that are image elements. So in our current selection are those 2 images. And we do only want to select the very first one for the reason that comes in a moment. Let's take a look at first child. Doesn't work. since first child is behaving differently. It's taking a look at the very first element, and if this one is in fact an image element, if this condition is met, then it will select it. Otherwise it will not. And therefore the first element is an H2 element. The image element is actually at the 5th position in here, not at the very first. Therefore we do have nothing inside here. 0 elements have now been selected. Let's go for our other option that we do have, first of type. And now this one will succeed for the reason that we have already reduced inside our element selection. We have reduced it already down to one single element type. We have only selected the 2 image elements, only that type. Meaning first of type, what it will do, it will select the very first one of each type, but since there is only one type already in our selection, therefore only the very first one will be selected. There won't be any more elements being selected. So this one would make us succeed. This one would select the very first image element. And now comes the actual use case why we went for the very first image element, and that is because we want the very first image element to have a margin on the right side. And no other element shall have a margin on the right side, not the other image element. Since what we want to achieve here is we want those 2 images to take up their entire line until here. The article elements, which is the container box for all inside here, that one I have given already a padding, which we can see right here, so that the text is not right at the edge. So I have given it a gap inside the box of 10 pixels, same on this side as well, on left and on the right. And what we now want is, we want that image, both of these images, they shall take up as much as possible. So until here, 100% of what is available to them. Therefore, I will now increase the width of those 2 images to 49. And if we would now give both of those images a margin on the right side, then this would mean that the next image would not be completely at the end right here, since there is a margin then being applied on the last image. So therefore I have now selected, or we have now selected the very first image only in order to give only this one a margin on the right side. And this one now ultimately will not cause any gap to be here. It will completely take up whatever is there until the padding area, of course, which is set on the parent, on the article element, and there is only a gap on the right side of the very first image element. Now, of course, we could have gone once again the other way around. We could have selected the last image and only applied a margin on the left side here and no margin on the very first image. Would have resulted in the exact same result ultimately. So it's just the way we want to go depends completely in that situation, completely depends on us. So that is another example, one more example I want to go over, and that is in regards to the next article that is underneath. And this article is starting with a P element. And maybe we have multiple articles here, and some of those articles, the headline is not immediately starting. The article is not immediately starting with a headline. For example, with some random information first of all, before the actual article starts. And maybe we have several articles that are having that information first before the article starts, and then some other articles immediately start inside with the headline and so on. So in that situation, we, for example, only want to select the P element, the first child of the article, if it is a P element, and not only under that condition, never else. So therefore, what I will now be targeting, I'm targeting all the article elements by selecting the element by type, since the other one is also an article element, so meaning all articles are now being selected. From that point onwards, we want the P element, but only when it is, we want the first child, but only when it is a P element. So let's go for the first child, and what is happening right now is that this one only applies to this element here. Since this is the only one that is the first child inside its parent, here in fact it is a H2 element, meaning the condition is not being met, therefore we have, it's only being applied to this P element in the second article, which is the first child inside its container box. And in such a situation we could not go, or we would not achieve this result by going for first of type. Since first of type will just always select the first of its type, and therefore in regards to its parent, and therefore we would have two elements being selected, this one and this one, and this is one example where first child would be the only option to go for. So let me just apply it on the article on this very first P element, and let me give it a different, for example, a different font style of italic. And let me reload the page. It has only been now affected the article in which the first child is in fact a P element. What now happens if we do not only want to select the very first one, the very last one? We want, for example, to select the second one, the fifth one, or for example, we want to select the first two, the first five, the last four, every second, every third, every fourth, all these kind of things. Selections, reductions, selection reductions we can do by using our next pseudo selectors, which we are now introducing. And that is, first of all, nth-of-type, nth-last-of-type, which is once again just the opposite, starting at the end. And then we have nth-child and nth-last-child, which this one is just the opposite, starting at the end instead of at the beginning to count, to select the elements. Let's once again start with our type selector nth-of-type, and once again let us focus on those orange boxes first of all before we are going into real examples. Let us first of all get used to those new pseudo selectors. Let me therefore scroll up once again to our 12 orange container boxes, which are comprised of two different element types, the div and the p, and which are inside the section, which I have given an identity of selectors container. Therefore, since all the other ones have not been given a class or identity, so I'm selecting the parent which has an identity. From that point onwards, let me once again start with all div elements. So right now we have all the div elements that are children of the element with the identity selectors container. From that point onwards, we want the second one, the second div. And we do so now by using the nth-of-type selector. And the nth, that name here is what it actually says, is the nth. It could be the x, the nth child, the x child, that child. So it's just referring to the fifth, the sixth, whatever it ultimately is. And what we actually want is defined inside the brackets. So this pseudo selector is actually a function in which we can insert something into those brackets, into those function brackets, and tell the browser what we actually want, which one, which nth, which x do we want. For example, number 2. And we are now reducing down our selection from all the divs down to only the very second one. And this is now the one that's being selected. Of course, once again, let me go for the p elements. So without now considering the pseudo selector, what we have selected by using our element selection part is we have selected all the p elements that are children of the element with the identity selectors container. From that point onwards, we only want the second one. This one is now inside our selection. In this situation, once again, since we have already reduced inside our element selection part, that is the element selection part, inside here we have already reduced it down to only one single type, the p type of element. Therefore, there will never be more than one element be selected. However, when the element part consists of multiple element types, as it is the case when we once again go for our asterisk selector, which represents all. Now we have selected all the children that are inside the element with the identity selectors container. And those children are comprised of two different element types, which are div and p elements. And therefore nth-of-type has its certain behavior once again. It will not only select one element but multiple. In this case, since the original selection is comprised of two different types, it will now also select two elements. It will select two elements of each type, one always at the second position, the second div as well as the second p element. So this is what nth-of-type is doing when we only supply a number inside here. Let us now take a look at the nth-child, what this one is doing. And once again, once we only supply a number in here, it's exactly the same behavior that is going on here. Let me change it to the div. Now this one is now seen differently. The logic is now different here, what's going on. So what the browser will do, it will take a look at the second child inside its parent element, which is this one. And now comes the condition. If this one is a div element, then it will be selecting it, otherwise not. So in this situation, the second child inside its parent is a div element, therefore it has now been selected, and this means we have one element inside our selection. And sometimes there can be 0 elements being selected if the condition is not met, as it would be the case if I changed it to a p element. The browser takes a look at the second child inside of the parent element, and if this element is a p element, it selects it. However, this one is a div element, resulting in nothing being selected by using this selection. If we once again go for the all selector, so with the all selector we are completely free. Still the browser would take a look at the second child now, and if the condition, but the condition is completely free, it can be anything, can be of any type. So if we are using the asterisk selector, it will definitely select one element. Since that second element can be of any type, the condition will always be met in this situation. So this is what nth-child, and of course there is also nth-last-child. As explained, it's just the opposite. So what the browser is now doing is it's taking, let me change it to the div. It's selecting the second last div element, meaning it's the 7th position here. It's selecting now the second last child from the end. It's taking a look at this element here. And if this one is in fact a div element, it will select it, otherwise not. So therefore this one is AP, it will not select it. It's just the other way around. Same happens with nth-of-last-type. This one also exists. So nth-of-last-type, same thing, same logic behind it, just starting from the end. Nth-of-last-type. So what this one would do now, it would select in fact now the 7th div element, the second last of its type. And the type we have already specified, winded it down to the div only, and therefore there is only one type. And this is the div, the second last is this one. Let's go back to, let's remove the last part here, nth-of-type, and let's take a further look inside these function brackets. Since there is not only a number that we can specify here, this number is always telling us the position. In always, whether we are using the child or the type. This is always the position that we want. Now if we are attaching an n to it, then what this n is representing is every. So meaning in this situation we want every second div element. He is starting automatically at the second one also. Second, fourth, sixth, eighth. These ones will now be selected. Every, this is what n is referring to. And if we do not specify anything else, then what is used in that third part of that selection is the same number that we have used right here. And this number is representing the starting point. So it is starting to select the div elements at position, at the starting point, at the position number 2. And then from that point onwards, it goes on to select every second one. So from position 2, 4, 6, 8. And this number is always the same by default as the number right here when we are making use of the n. So if I would now change this to a 3, then this one would automatically, if we do not change it ourselves, it would automatically be plus 3. It would automatically start at position 3. And then select every third one from that position onwards. 3, 6, and then there is no 9th element, and so on, however. And of course we could change it. It's completely up to us. We can change that starting value, for example, to 1. So what is happening in this case, it's starting at 1. From that point onwards, it's selecting every third one. 4, 7, and that's it, since there is no 10th div element right in here. And what we can also do is we can just specify an n. And what this n is doing, it's 1n. n just means 1. We just don't need to specify the 1. n is 1n. And therefore, what's used by default, if we don't specify anything else, this is also being 1 now. And therefore, if we only specify n, then it will just select each and every div element. However, this of course would be the same if we just left it like this. However, nevertheless, what we can do is we can specify a starting point here. different than 1, which is used by default. So if we are going now for 5, for example, so what the browser will do, it will take a look at the 5th one, and from that point onwards, it will select each and every one of them. Not every second, but every one. This one is just not necessary to indicate to the browser, since n is automatically is 1. Now what we can also do is use a minus, a negative value right here. And this negative value would tell the browser, hey, still start at point number 5. So in this case, the div number 5, and then go backwards and select everything before as well. And don't go the other way. Don't go forward, but backwards. This is something else we can do. And also, 2 more things I want to discuss now is we can use 2n plus 2, which would basically, this is always the default that's being used, the 2, the same as this one, so we not necessarily need to specify it. So this one is always starting at point number 2, and therefore every second one, which results in all the odd ones, all the even ones being selected. And this is an alternative. There is even a keyword that does actually exist that we can also use if we wanted to, which just selects every second one starting at point the even ones, or every second even one, the second, all the even ones, 2, 4, 6, and 8. And there is also the other one, the opposite, which is odd, and this one will just select all the odd ones, 1, 3, 5, 7, and odd of course is the same if we would specify 2n plus 1 starting at 1, and then every second one, 3, 5, 7. Let me now change the selector to all, to once again take a look at this one. So what this one will cause is, let me change it to 3n plus 1. We are starting at position number 1, and we want every third one. However, inside our element selections are not only one type, but 2 types, p and div. So what we are doing here is, we are selecting the first one, we are starting at the first one, and we are selecting every third, number 4, number 7, and then it's not gonna be number 10 in this situation. So in this case it would be this element. Instead here it starts all over again. So this is 1, 2, 3. So only this one would be selected, the P. The third, the 6th, and then the third P once again. Since this one is a different type now, so it starts all over again. Let's take a look at nth-child, and then we are going into actual examples. Nth-child. So what we have already taken a look at is 3. Now let's attach an n to it. And by default, once again, there is no difference. Again, the default value then that's also used for the starting point is 2. Always the same one as we have specified here, which element we want. And now what nth-child is doing. Let me reduce it down to a div element. And the browser will take a look at the second element now. Now this is not different from, if this is different from using just a number. So here the condition still applies. What the browser takes a look at is, it looks at the second child, and then if this one, the second child inside its parent, is in fact the condition is a div element, it will select it, otherwise it will not. However, as soon as we are attaching an n afterwards, this condition logic thinking is not applied anymore, or we do not need to follow it. It's not involved in this actual process now here anymore, since now the second one is being selected, the 4th, the 6th, the 8th, all of them are selected. There is no condition that is now relevant here anymore. So as soon as we are attaching an every here, by using the n, every, then we can forget about that condition part that was relevant before, and also when we made use of first and last child. However, everything else is exactly the same as before, then as with type selector. So we can also change the starting point here. We can change, of course, every third, every fourth. We can also use that negative n here. It's exactly the same as with the type. And let us now go into actual real examples, and that one will involve now our table once again. If we wanted to select, for example, now the second TD elements in each row. This one is not possible, of course, by using the first or the first child or first type selector, since this is the second one. So we can select the second column by using now one of those selectors. Let me therefore once again scroll down to the table. what we want to do is we want to select now the second TD element, so meaning the third column here. This is column number 1, this is 2, and this one. This column we want. And this involves this third element inside the table row. This one we want for each and every row. So therefore, once again, let me select the table body. From in here, we want all the TD elements that are descendants. And from that point onwards, we want to go for nth-child or nth-of-type. Let's take a look what is the difference in this situation. So what we want is, we want the TD element, the nth-of-type, meaning the second. So here we are going for the number 2, since the first element here is a th element. So the second TD element which we have selected, the second one is representing the third column. Always the second TD element. In comparison, if we would go for nth-child, now this number would not represent the third column anymore. Instead, it would represent the second child inside its parent. And if this second child is in fact a TD element, it will be selected. So the condition is met. However, we actually wanted to select the third column. And therefore, we need to go for 3, of course, here, instead of 2 that we have used for nth-of-type. So since now the third child is being selected and not the second of its type. So either we go for the number 2 when we are using nth-of-type, or we are going for the number 3, since the third child, not the second type, then when we are using nth-child. But in this situation, once again, both of the options are available to us, and both of them ultimately let us select the third cell in each row of the table body, to which we can now give, for example, let me just once again go for a certain color in green, and this one will now give every cell, every third cell inside each row inside the table body a green look, and it will indirectly therefore allow us to select columns once again, since there is no element that actually represents a column, so we are doing things indirectly kind of here. And of course we could also go for the fourth one, and of course as the logic already says, and we can also go for all the remaining ones by just changing now the selector. So what we want is, we want the nth-child, and from this point onwards we want the second one. If we want to select now the second child, now let's stay with the third one, and we also want the fourth and the third column to receive this setting, and this is what we can do by just applying now an n. So what we want is, we want we want the n, and then starting at point 3. And this will select now all of them actually. We need to go for the second one, which will also select all of them. And this is because I have used a negative value here instead of a plus. So therefore now 3 will work again. And here we go. Now all the remaining columns have been selected. We want everyone starting at the TD at the child number 3. Every other one. Starting here, all the other ones. These ones are being selected right now. Let's go into our next example, and that one involves our boxes, in fact, on which we have done all the examples on. Since those boxes, it's kind of a similar example that we have already done by using our images. Since we wanted those images to take up the entire available space in that line, so things look equal, so that there is an equal space as well as here. And this is now what we also want to do to our boxes. In this situation, however, we are not dealing with 2 boxes in one line, we are dealing with 3 boxes. Each of these boxes I have given a width already of 32%. And there are 3 boxes next to each other, which ultimately gives us a total width for them together of 96%. And each line has 100% available, so we do have 4% left that we can make use of, and those 4% we want to use for the margin in between here and in between here. However, the third element shall not have a margin right here. It shall go all the way until the end, as far as it can, until the padding comes of those 10 pixels right here, which I have also applied here, as we can see on the left side. So So we have 96% in width for all these three boxes, and now let's give them also a margin on the right side of 2%. And this will mean that we now have a margin here of 2%, here as well as here, which is 6% plus 3 times 32 is 96 plus 6 is 102%, meaning there is not enough space for all these elements to be in one line. Since we are making use of 102%, we are exceeding the 100% of which space we only have available in one line. And this is the reason, since the third element also has a margin on the right side of 2%, which we now want to remove, and then we are down to exactly 100%. So how do we select now every third element? Which selection part do we use? Do we use nth-child or nth-of-type? Once again, first of all, let me select the parent element with the identity selectors container. From that point onwards, we want all the elements. And that now already shows us we have now more than one element type inside our selection. And if we are now using the nth-of-type selector, then this will mean that the element types 2 times will be affected. So if we want to select every third one in order to give every third box not a margin on the right side, to set the margin on the right to 0. And if we are going for the nth-of-type, we are selecting now by default, what's being used here is +3, that's by default, meaning we are starting at the element number 3, which is fine. This one shall not have a margin on the right, neither shall have the 6th one a margin on the right, so this one will also be selected. And the 9th element shall also not have a margin. However, this one is not being inside our selection, since the browser is starting all over again right here. This is a new type. So here, this is 1 again, 2. So this one is being selected instead. Let us now take a look at this visually as well. And let me give it a margin let me reset the margin from 2% down to 0. Margin on the right side down to 0. And with a semicolon, and right here we can see it. The third one has now no margin on the right side. The 6th one neither. However, the 9th one is a new type. This one still has a margin on the right side. Since from here the browser starts all over again, this is 1, this is 2, and this one, now the third of this type, has now no margin on the right side. So this is what's going on, and in this situation, therefore, we need to select nth-child. Nth-child will just select every third of them. There is no condition anymore that we need to pay attention to. It will just select every third, starting also at point number 3, meaning 3, 6, 9, and 12, giving always the exact those boxes no margin, which gives us the result that we wanted ultimately to have. One more example, let me also use once again those boxes. If we wanted to select, for example, the first 5 boxes to have a certain background color, then once again we can go for just n and using that minus symbol. So we are selecting all the div elements that are inside here, and from that point onwards we want nth-child or nth-of-type, doesn't matter in this situation since we have already reduced it down to only one single type. And from this point onwards we want everyone starting at going backwards then, and we want to start at position number 5. We are starting here, and by using this negative symbol here, so by default there is also a 1 here. And from this point onwards we want every single one of them going backwards, which would then give them a different background color if we apply it. Let me give those ones a background of green. And here we go. Those 5 have now been affected. Let us now take a look at 2 more, and that is the only-child and the only-of-type. And in order to get familiar with them, let us take a look at the article in this situation and the second article. Let us go into the actual code that we do have right down here. And this second article here, this one has one p element in which there is only one element inside. And this is exactly what only-child is doing. So when there is one element that only has one element inside it, then this one will be selected. So let me go for the article in this case, article, and let us go down into all the P elements that are children of the article, and from that point onwards, let's go for only child. Now, what is being selected right now is nothing. Since we always, as we have done before always, we first need to go down, further down, in order for the browser to investigate how many children are in there. So let me go down, all of them, and they are the only child. It's investigating now all the P elements, it's taking a look inside them, and if there is only one element inside those P elements, then this one will be selected. This is what only child is doing. So let me just do an example. Let me apply some setting on this one. And here, let me go for letter spacing, a letter spacing of 3 pixels. So who's been affected? Only that very last P element that has only one single element inside it. The other one would be, for example, the only of type. Let me therefore select as an example the very first article here only, and from that point onwards, we want to select all. And now we are attaching the pseudo part, the minimizer, only of type. So what this one is doing, it's not taking a look now inside here, and in order to find out whether there is only one single element inside, which would be only child, then this one would be selected. If this one would be the only child inside the article. In comparison, the only of type, what this one is looking at, it's taking a look at the different element types, and if there is only one element of that type inside there, then it will select it. So in this situation, the only one that's of single type in here is the H2 element. Since the P element consists 3 times in here, and the image element is there 2 times, the only one that is of its only type is the H2 element, and this one would now be selected. So let me also give this one quickly a certain appearance. Let me make it text decoration underline. And underline. Now the one that has been affected only is the headline, nothing else. Since the other elements are inside its parent element multiple times, the only of type is the H2 element. This is only of type and only child. One more is empty and not, and the empty one is taking a look not whether there is one element inside, it's taking a look, and when there is no element and no text inside, then this element will be selected. And a useful example would, for example, be in regards to our table, whenever we are having empty cells, such as inside our table head. The first cell here is empty, and if we want to remove the background right here, then we can do so. We can select all the TH elements, for example, inside the table head in this situation. So inside the table head, all the TH elements that are descendants from that point onwards, and we only want to select the ones that do neither have elements nor text inside them. And then we can, for example, remove the background color. So let me give it a background of transparent. So this is how we remove the background always, by using then the background, the transparency then. So whatever is in the background will shine through. One more thing I want to now apply on this empty cell as well is I want to remove the border in order to indicate something that sometimes, it happens sometimes, border on the right side of none. This one will not be applied now. So the reason for this is because we have already given a border on the right side here of 1 pixel in white, and this selection is more specific than this one. So specificity is going on here, and when we are dealing with pseudo selectors, it sometimes happens that we are encountering a specificity issue. So that would be one example, and we have gotten used to that pointing system. So when we are selecting elements by their type, this is 1 point. Since this one is least specific, it's very low in points. Now, if we are going for classes or pseudo classes, this one is 10 points. So this is already more specific than just selecting by type. So how many points do we have here? We have 1, we have 2, we have 3, and then 10, which is 13 in total. Right down here we have 1, we have 2, we have 10, which is 12 in total. So therefore this is less specific, this selection, and therefore the border right to none is not being applied. We can always, once again to remind us, we can always find this out easily in order when we are attaching important since this one, irrespective of specificity, will always give us now, will always be taken. So here we can see, in order for us to investigate whether there is actually a specificity issue going on in the first place. So this one is used for such a circumstance, for example. Now, in order to now make this more specific, let me just use now also the table to which the t-head is a child of. Let me use this one, meaning now I have just added another point. So we do have now 3 points here, 10 points, 13, which is now the exact same amount of points which we have right here. And in such a trade-off situation, the one that's coming afterwards will always be selected. The one in case now both have 13 points, so this one is coming afterwards, now the border will not be applied. So this is empty. One more pseudo selector we have, and that is not. By this element, this is also once again a function, since we can specify something. We can always exclude a certain element from the selection, not only one but several elements, by just specifying it in here, either by identity. For example, we want to exclude from the selection the element with the identity XX, or for example, we want to exclude the element with the class name YY, or for example, we want to exclude the element by its type. All the div elements shall not be selected. Or for example, we can also exclude an element by using a pseudo selector as well, one of those minimizers. First child, for example. We want to select all of them, but not the first child, as an example. Let us now go into one visual example. Once again, let me target those boxes, and which I have given the first 5 a green background color, and let me now exclude, for example, the very first one. And we are right in here, and I now want to exclude the nth, the not. I do not want to select the first one, first child, for example, first child. The div element, if the condition is met, if the first one is a div, and the first one is a div element, therefore it will be excluded, and everything will be fine. And now the first one will still be orange. That is the last one. In regards to our minimizers, 2 more selectors we briefly want to take a look at, and these are 2 element selectors which we haven't yet gotten to familiar with or haven't yet discussed in this course, and these are the sibling selectors. By those selections, by the plus symbol, we can use the immediate following sibling, and by using the tilde selector we can select all the immediate following siblings. Therefore, let us once again take a look at the second article right here. Since this article is always comprised of H3 elements, since they are the third headline inside the actual part. So here is an H2 element, which is the headline, and then inside here is a P element, and now comes an H3 element. Inside here is a P, then comes an H3, inside here are 2 P paragraphs, and then comes again a headline 3, and then there are 2 P elements inside here. Let us now select the immediate following sibling from the H3 element. So from the H3 elements, we want the immediate following sibling, the P elements, and let me now give them, for example, a certain specific styling. And in order to have a visual example right now as well, let me give them a word spacing of, for example, 5 pixel, so a gap in between the words of 5 pixel, and this has now only affected the following, immediate following sibling of the H3 elements, which are the sub-headlines here. Meaning the second paragraph inside here has not been affected, since it is not an immediate following sibling of this H3 element, which only the first paragraph is. However, we can select them all by selecting all of the siblings, for example, using the tilde. Now they are also being affected. Now all the siblings are now affected. And by using those element selectors, we can already actually, for example, also go for our columns. We want to select the immediate next column, the next cell in each row, which represents then ultimately the column, or all the siblings inside the following siblings, which would give then, for example, select all the remaining columns. Such things we can also do by using those element selectors, the sibling element selectors. There are a little bit of a performance going on here, what we need to pay attention to. So what we most likely would always do is we would give our major parts, at least, such as a section, for example, or the major parts that are involved, we would give an identity or something, some major element that represents that part, at least. So we would not go for the body and from there onwards we would select every second one or something. So this would be very inefficient. There are performance concerns going on, since the browser always needs to inspect then the entire element inside here for each selection, which is not a good idea. I will be going into a little bit more into performance in the very last week, which is week number 18, in which we are finalizing the HTML and the CSS part of this course. And there I will talk a little bit more about performance, where not only these pseudo selectors are then inside this judgment, ultimately also a couple of other things. Let us now move on to our second part, and that is a very tiny part. There are only a couple of properties left that we haven't yet discussed, and that is outline, for example, which is very similar to the border. And therefore, first of all, let me give this email input field that I have created. Let me give this one a border first of all, and then we are comparing it to the outline. So this input field, I have given an identity of email field, and this one I am now giving a border of 10 pixel solid in blue. And we know that the border, and this is also the reason why we have discussed the border already, border takes part in how much, how wide and how high a certain element is. Unless, and this is what we have already done, we have already set all our elements to box sizing border box in order that when we add a border or a padding to a certain element, that this border or padding does not change the actual width or height of our element. Instead, that border will now be included in the width and the height. And therefore, what is happening right now is that this border is included in the height and the width. Therefore, there is only 5 pixels left for the actual content area of the element. Since it's only 25 pixel high and there is 10 pixel border that is needed, that's already occupied inside the element in height on the top and on the bottom as well. Therefore 20 pixel are gone for the border, giving us only 5 pixel left for the content area. And this is what border is doing. It's involved in the dimensions and in determining how much space there will be for the content area as well. And this is already the first difference from outline. And the second difference, first of all, is it has exactly the same values. Outline is just a frame, kind of. It's a border further outside. It's outside of the border area. And here we also define a color. We also define a style that we want that border, kind of border, to have, this outline. And we also define a width ultimately, just in the exact opposite way as we would do it with the border. So first we start with the color, then with the style, and then with the width, the thickness that this outline, this border shall actually have. So why this is going in the exact other way, why they didn't make it the exact same value order for the border as for the outline, I cannot tell you. Maybe to just differentiate them more, but yeah, I don't know. So what is going on here? First of all, it's different that the order here is different. It's different that it is outside the border area, and it is different as it does not take up any space. Here we can see it's not involved in the dimensions of the element, neither does it affect any other element on the page. Therefore, it's kind of out of the flow, or it's not kind of, it is out of the flow. It's not taking part in the dimensions. It's not involving, it's not affecting any other element. So this is outline. And this outline is also just a shortcut. A shortcut for the individual ones, outline color, outline style, and outside width, as we have already determined right in here. In addition to this, there is also outline offset, by which we can determine how far away shall the outline actually be from the border area. How far away shall it be? So in this situation, let me offset it, for example, by 5 pixels. and this one will now be 5 pixels away towards the outside from its original position that it had. This one is not supported by Internet Explorer, however otherwise it's supported all fine. And now comes the actual sense, why and when would we go for an outline. Let me remove the offset here. And let me change this dotted now to a solid style. And this is exactly when we would use it, when we are dealing with some sort of input fields, in order to indicate, hey, this input that has now been done by a person here, this input is invalid. It's not an actual email address. Or for example, this email has already been registered. Or for example, this password has not enough characters. You need at least one symbol, one number, blah, blah, blah. All these kind of things are invalid inputs. And in order to indicate to the user clearly where the invalid happened, where this error happened, in order to indicate that clearly we are creating an outline in addition to text in which would have the meaning what is actually wrong here. So for example, this email address is invalid, or this password is too short. In addition, we would give an outline to make it more clear, stylistically clear to the person, hey, this is where the error actually occurred. And this outline, of course, we do not want to take up any space. Let's imagine that we have created those input fields in order that they may take up exactly the width, the amount of width that they could take up, 100%. And if this outline would then appear, that would mean that more than 100% of the width would be taken, causing then other elements to move down into the next line. So this one shall not take up shall not be involved in the dimensions. In width and height, it shall not take up any space, and this is where outline is used. Any other use I don't see, just for input fields. Let's go into the other one, and that is a border radius. And let's give our boxes, our orange boxes, rounded corners. And we can do so by either selecting the corners individually, top left, top right corner, etc. Or we can select them all at once by using the shortcut. And this is where they are. These are all our orange boxes. Border radius, that is the actual shortcut by which we can define a border radius for all the 4 corners on our box. Individual values are border top left radius, border top right, border bottom right, and border bottom left radius. Of course, to give a certain value to only one single border. So this one, of course, these are the individual ones. And once we apply a value here, top left is always, of course, is this one. And this one has now received a rounded corner of 10 pixels. The border radius itself is the shortcut. And here we can once again, same as with padding and margin, for example, also border image slice, for example, here we can use 1, 2, 3 or 4 values. If we are making use of only one value, now this one is then being applied on all the 4 corners. If we are making use of 2 values, let me therefore make it a little bit more clear. Let me change this one to 20 pixels and the second value is 5 pixels. The first one will be applied to the top left and to the bottom right, and the second value will be applied to the top right and the bottom left. So top left and bottom right have now 20 pixels in roundness right here, and the other ones have 5 pixels. Now let me make use of a 0 here, meaning of 3 values, and in this situation this one is referring to the top left and this one is referring to the bottom right, and the middle value is referring to top right and bottom left. So now this one will not have any rounded corners. Those ones have 5 pixels and this one has 20 pixels. Let me now go for the last one, also for 40 pixels right in here, and those 40 pixels will then refer to the bottom left. It's going kind of clockwise. We have to assume that here is 12 o'clock. 12, 3, 6, 9 o'clock. This is the values in how they will ultimately be applied, and we have 40 pixels now right at this last corner at 9 o'clock. And now comes one more thing in regards to border radius. Since the border is actually made up of 2 parts, it's always the horizontal and the vertical part. So this one is actually, that's the middle of the border. And on the left there is one part that's coming from the horizontal way. until the middle here, and the other one is coming from the vertical down here. So each border is made up of two parts actually, and we can make each part have a different value as well by separating things by a forward slash. Now all these values will always represent the vertical part, and the second value in this situation will represent the horizontal part. So let me go for an exaggerated high value of, for example, 100 pixel, and here we go. Here we can see it's 100 pixel that's now being applied. It's quite, we need to go for a little bit more here in order to see actually the difference. We may see it. It's very slightly going out here. So this is what the second value is doing. It is in charge of the vertical one, which is quite a high one. Let me just change it to 30 so we can see it a little better. So here, this is this part, the vertical part of the rounded corners, and this is the horizontal part. Wherever the horizontal part is in charge of the part, that's the horizontal part. And here we can see clearly that we can create shapes by using the border radius, and not only by using the border radius, but also by using box shadow, as we will find out next week. Box shadow, first of all, let's go over this one too, and let's apply a box shadow on the actual box. And first of all, let me once again go into text shadow, since this one we have already discussed. And text shadow has three values that we definitely need to specify and in order to see an effect, and that is how far shall the shadow go horizontally. For example, 3 pixel. How far shall it go vertically? For example, 3 pixel. And then the color, for example, red. Red. And let's take a look at the result once again. So this is just now a duplication of the actual, it's a shadow, a duplication of the actual text, just moved a little bit further to the right, horizontally, vertically, and it has been given now the background color of, the color of red. And if we want that shadow to go into another direction, we can do so by specifying negative values, either for the horizontal and the vertical one, or individually, of course, as well. So here we can always define the direction by using those positive or negative values. What we can also specify, which is not compulsory, which is optional for text shadow, is the blur effect. How much shall this shadow blur? And for example, let me make it blur 2 pixel. How much shall it fade into each other, kind of blurry, get blurry, as it is the situation right now. It has now been blurred by 2 pixel. And these values are the exact values that we can also use just when we are dealing with non-text elements, such as with any other boxes, any non-text elements, and which one I'm now giving 4 pixel horizontally, vertically as well. And then I also wanted to have a blur effect. Let me go for 3 pixel, and the color that I want to use now is, let me go for blue. And here we have now a shadow being applied on the box itself. And this shadow, once again, of course, we can use negative values in order to define where it shall go, either horizontally or vertically. And in actual fact, we can also bring the shadow inside a box. And this is exactly an additional value that we now have available for box shadow that does not exist for text shadow, and that is inset. Kind of bring it in, invert it basically. And because it inverts it, it does not only bring it in, it brings it to the opposite end as well. And now it makes maybe sense to use negative values in order to bring it to that side of the box. So we do have complete control ultimately of where that shadow shall be, and we are not bound to only use one shadow. We can also use multiple ones by just dividing it up by comma. So let me go for another shadow at the outside of also 4 pixel, for example. Let me also make that one blurry of 3 pixel, and let me give it a color of red. And now we do also have a shadow at the outside. One more value actually exists, and that is the value of spread. How much shall the blur spread in all directions? And let me make it spread by 3 pixel, so this will just spread the blurring effect. This is another additional value that we do also have besides the inset value. These two are new. These two cannot be applied on the text itself. Since with text it would just make it inset, doesn't exist, there is nothing where we can bring it into, inverted, and the spread would just make it too much unreadable, the text. The reason why this one does not exist for text. And by using multiple values here, more and more and more, we will find out next week that we can actually create shapes. And what we have just seen with border radius, we can definitely create shapes. And also by using the border property, we can do so. And this is exactly the topic at the beginning of next week, which we will take a look at triangles, for example, rounded shapes, and a couple of other ones. And then afterwards we are going into the topic of animation.